instead of trying to blow through it all. So, thank you, Gary, for giving us a little bit of extra time. It's for some of us, this is kind of what we live and breathe every day. And personally, for me, the accessible health care is very important. I come from the healthcare world, and I've seen how it operates, and
I'm looking for my.
maybe hold it to a higher standard than others do. Okay. But it is important for me. And I'll tell you a couple of personal stories. We're going to talk about medical equipment at the end of this day, but last week before last, recently, I went in for an X-ray and had to wait for a while because of some issues with the order and all that. Once I finally got into the X-ray room, the X-ray table was about my eye height, so that was about 38, 40, probably about 40 inches. And I mean, I knew it was coming. And I still didn't want to have to deal with what I was going to have to deal with. So I just said, "Where's your lift?" And the guy looked at me and he said, "What lift?" And I said, "So I can get onto that table." And reached down. I wish I'd put that picture in here. I have to do it for next week. Pulls out, there's a little built-in step stool that's part of the X-ray table. It's about yay big. Pulls it out. He says, "Hop on up." I'm not kidding at all. "Hop on up." And I said, "Oh, if that were true, if only I could." And he said, "Well, here's another step stool, and you put that other step stool, the ones that have long handles so you don't have to bend over, you put that right next to the other little step." And he said, "Well, that'll help." Your head just wants to pop off your body, and you just want to scream and cuss at them and say unladylike things that my mother won't let me say. So, but had cool heads prevailed in these kinds of situations, and I said, "Well, I can't just hop on up there. What's your procedure for this situation?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, okay, that's not your fault. That's St. Vincent's fault. I know y'all don't know St. Vincent's, but it's a hospital system. And I'm at the point where I'm ready to name names. That's your employer's fault." I said, "Do you have somebody that could maybe help you lift me up onto that table?" And he said, "Well," and I said, "Look, I'm 4'8", I weigh 130 pounds. This is not a hard task." So we went and got the guy next door, and their thought was that I could stand up on the step stool thing and lean against the table, and they'd help me from there. Okay, well, that's not really what I had in mind. And they were hesitant, and since they were hesitant, I was hesitant, and I ended up just leaving. Didn't get the X-ray, and I was trying to not be mad at those guys. I said, "Look, it's not your fault. You're not trained on how to handle this, and you don't have the proper equipment to make sure it happens, number one, and that it happens safely for all of us, number two." So that was that experience. That was 2 weeks ago. I still haven't gotten an X-ray, so I'm going to have to go to a different facility downtown Birmingham, pay for parking, take another couple of hours off of work, and it's all because they don't see the legal, moral, ethical obligation in following these things. Now, on the flip side of that, at UAB in downtown Birmingham, I have a spina bifida clinic that I go to every year. So this, where the clinic's located, they see spinal cord injury patients. I mean, they just have a lot of high-level disability patients that they see. And I went for a test there a couple of months ago. It was another thing where it was a really high procedure table, probably a little bit higher than that X-ray table was. And they brought in a lift, and I've been using a chair for at least 15 years. I've never been on the receiving end of a lift, one of those mechanical lifts. So that was kind of cool. So they put the sling under me and hooked it up. And, you know, back when I was doing PT, you had to hook it up and then you had to manually pump it up to raise them up. This one was cool. They just hooked it up, pushed a button, and it raised me up, weighed me while I was there. I get weighed once a year. Before I started going to this clinic, I hadn't been weighed in 10 years, which for a lot of women is a good thing. But I kind of get on my high horse about that, I guess. But they weighed me, and it was very exact weight measurement because it was just me in the gown and the sling. So wheeled me over and pushed the little button again, and it laid me right down. The funny thing about that lift was they only had an extra large sling size, and I'm 4'8", and not a hardy 4'8", and it would just kind of in a cocoon. It wrapped me head to toe. But I felt safe. I didn't ever doubt what they were doing or that they knew how to use that equipment, or that they were going to drop me. Where on the flip side, those guys 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't have let them take my trash out. So I help train our surveyors a lot, and if they don't have somebody in there, I always wonder what their motivation is for doing this job. Y'all know it's a hard job, it's long days, it's a lot of travel. You go to really nice places and spend the day in the toilet. There has to be some reason to do it other than making money. And so I always like to hear their thoughts, but it also gives me the opportunity to say, here's why these requirements are in place. They're not just abstract things that people make up. Sometimes it seems like that, like the 5-inch code on the wall that used to be in the toilet room section. I don't know what that has to do with accessibility, but most of these requirements are there for a reason. They serve somebody, and they just kind of make the world a better place. And so that's my little story. So this is important to me. It's kind of my passion. It is a little bit of a soapbox, and it is a sacrifice to do what we all do day to day, standing in those stinky toilet rooms and standing out in the sun, measuring parking lots, fighting with building officials. Sorry, building officials? Discussing. Yeah. So, okay, so pick up where we left off. Lavatory sinks and hand washing fixtures are all, I just want to do this to do the pointer.
Yeah, no, me too. Laser pointer on it.
When you see this, that's what that means. All have to meet the same 34-inch height requirement. That's the same as we had for ages. The center line from the sidewall distance only applies to lavatories, and that's 18 inches from the center line to the adjacent sidewall or partition, if there is a sidewall. The DSA checklist indicates that this requirement is to any sidewall or partition. We'll keep you, Crystal. I mean,
Oh, that's all right.
I am so sorry.
He should be proud of that.
And he's not here. And Jason probably could tell him. Hand washing fixtures in non-accessible patient rooms must meet requirements for hand washing fixtures. That's according to the code application notice. We have seen some instances where there's a toilet room connected to the patient room, but there's not a lab in it. So you just have to be, well, you have to be mindful of if there's a lab in that toilet room or not. In California, it's really not such a big deal because all those sinks, labs, and hand washing fixtures have to be accessible, where in other states you can bypass that a little bit. Then I have to get my coordinate. So thinking about all hand washing fixtures and sinks have to be accessible, we see these in exam rooms. Weighing outside of California, we're typically weighing who uses the sink and why. asking, is it a hand washing sink? Is it a service sink of some kind? Is it associated with the task that an employee, so that an employee can do their job? It doesn't really matter in California, unfortunately. But there is an argument for if the public or patients or their family members use these sinks, is some kind of cross-contamination going to happen? Is it really good hygiene? The thought of somebody filling a water bottle in this setting just, I think, gives us all the heebie-jeebies. But the Access Board we have heard them talk about this argument, or this reasoning as an argument to not make all of those sinks accessible. So it does come back to being a legal question or a policy and procedure question. We don't know of anybody at DOJ that has said this out loud or in writing, so I wouldn't say that this is enforceable. It's probably an opinion at this point, anywhere outside of California. Scrub sinks, of course, don't have to be accessible because the exception in CDC. There could be a need for reasonable accommodation for an employee under Title I. This one here in the middle, Google search, and this for an accessible scrub sink, and that was what they came up with. And it's, they've done a pretty good job. It's made an attempt at knee and toe space. What about the controls? Are they operated by foot or by knee mechanism where you have to kind of nudge the control over with your knee? I've seen some of those, or is it automatic? So you just have to think about who's using it and where it's located. On each side, the photos on each side, these are both in NICU situations. So, and the one on the left was actually
NICU? Is that what you said?
neonatal
Neonatal
ICU.
intensive care unit.
And the one on the left was in the dressing room, locker room that parents use. So in a NICU situation, they come in and gown up typically, wash their hands, go visit the baby, and then do the reverse process when they come out. So just think about who's using that scrub sink and why. Yeah, there's the exception there, but
Yeah, I'll toss in a little bit here. So from the building code standpoint, in OSHPD 1, 2, 3, and 4 facilities, the plumbing code, OSHPD has put a table in the plumbing code, and it specifies unit by unit what you have to have. So every OSHPD 1, 2, 3, and 4 facility has to have, inside of each nursing unit, one hand washing fixture, in each radiology unit. And they go room by room by room in a utility room. Solid utility room it has to have, and there's a little table that says hand washing fixture. And then they specify the hand washing fixture has to have a gooseneck spout. You're not allowed to have an aerator on the bottom of it because the aerator could collect mold or other germs. So it's really specifically required by code to be a specific thing. It's not designed for patients and their families to fill water bottles. Yeah.
And I was going to say also in the plumbing code, excuse me, or the building code references the plumbing code definition of scrub sink, which is OSHPD 1, 2, 3, and 4, and only for surgeons and nurses in preparatory to operating procedures. Right. So in the instance where I think mom and dad would wash up, that wouldn't be a scrub sink that meets that definition.
A scrub sink is entirely different from a hand washing fixture by code. It's a whole other level.
If you're able to be involved in the design process, maybe it does make more sense for it to be a hand washing sink and not a scrub sink. To me, a scrub sink is where they're going in to perform a procedure and they need to be sterile. Where a parent visiting a baby, they want to be as clean as they can be, and that can be accomplished in a hand washing fixture. But
well, that's part of again the building code reasoning, and one of the things we actually run into when our facility, our clients internally want to provide another fixture. We have to be careful that we provide the hand washing fixture, which is for staff use and required by code, And we can put right next to it, if we want to, a sink that provides a different function. It might be where you wash out coffee mugs or other things, but we do not, and the building officials do not want staff cleaning their hands in the same place where other things are happening. That's a big, big no-no. So if necessary, provide two separate fixtures right next to each other.
It's the same idea as a commercial kitchen, where you've got the scullery sink where they clean vegetables and food, and then they've got a separate fixture for hand washing. Does that make sense? Now we see a lot of, especially in older facilities, corridor sinks, probably intended for staff use, but in California it's a common use fixture, so they would have to be accessible. We have seen quite a few facilities where they have a policy that you have to wash your hands before and after visiting patients, and with the latest Ebola and things like that, I'm sure that those policies are probably being revisited and enforced a little bit more. Service mops and sinks are for job-specific tasks, and they are not required to meet accessibility requirements.
This one in the middle is a clinic sink, and that is like a toilet. It flushes just like a toilet. So what's called, you may see on paper, a drawing that shows a clinic sink, and you might be thinking in your mind's eye, it's more like a sink. This is more like a toilet.
Yeah, that was not a good example to use, but it goes back to that CAN notice about bedpan flushes. So eyewash sink. What are your big buzz things with eyewash sink?
Height.
I've actually run across a situation where the eyewash sink does need to be accessible to everyone because of the location and the use, okay, and it's a safety item. And there are no technical requirements specifically for eyewash, so we're struggling with how do you make an eyewash accessible? And we've come to the conclusion that it's very similar to a drinking fountain, and you need a high-low, or it needs to be an adjustable fixture that can be moved up and down to meet those requirements.
So you're looking at providing two instead of one?
Yes, and I'm curious to find out what everybody else is doing.
I use the low elevation and probably mislead the thought about a high-low, but I use the lower elevation. And this is close to that function of putting your face down at the same level as you.
Yes, this is where you have a shower connected to an eyewash. They don't have enough
My issue, my specific situation doesn't have a shower. It's just an eyewash and it's attached to a counter with a sink, not a lavatory, a sink.
Is there a requirement for the land condition here? Is there specifying a shower and eyewash as a combination?
I look at these as just a piece of equipment, and when I review it, it's more about the operating height and the optimal force and the pinching, twisting, and all those kinds of things that goes along with the standard piece of equipment. I understand that the function is similar to a drinking fountain, and there's a need to have it usable, functional as an eyewash. But from an accessibility perspective, there's no credence given to that concern other than as if you can operate it or not.
I did
But you have to be
call,
able to reach it. What you do is-
Just like any piece of equipment, it has to be within its range.
Yeah. So-
well, I actually did call the access board about it. And, I can't remember who I talked to, one of the names you guys have recognized. I'll have to look it up. He said that, yes, they would consider an eyewash in my situation, a feature that would need to be accessible, and he agreed that probably the access board was gonna be writing technical requirements sometime in the near future for them.
And was yours a program access situation?
Yes.
For chair users, that would have to be in that floor.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we thought, a drinking fountain.
Yeah, I love that approach, that's their approach.
And the SA always had in the checklist, the showing the accessible, eye wash at the height, similar to the requirement, and that was way back in the times of the SA checklist for plan review. And I will say that as a minimum to provide one, the accessible one, if you have the luxury of being able to do more as the best practice, to do the high-low will be better for others, but as a minimum, I would provide just the accessible one.
Sutter, we've been doing a number of things for you guys. What we've been asked to do is to use and we've done and actually what we turned out, they want us to use a hand one that you pull out and you can spray on your eyes, and that would meet the accessibility standards because now it's not fixed and you can't reach it, and they're next to the sink so you can pull right up to it using the sink part. And the other part that you have to understand is that what I found out, and this was just something new, was that they need to be, Sutter will test them once a week to make sure they're working. So if you take those caps off and you spray it, turn it on to test it, you end up with a wet counter everywhere. So they kind of like the hand because they can just aim it in the sink, test it, okay, work, and they walk away from it. So the testing it and it's meeting the ADA.
What about the operable mechanism?
Yeah, we have a
How
lot
does
of.
that meet the operable parts requirement?
Yeah.
Equipment to not grasp and.
Grasp, yeah,
And
that
pull.
would be the operable mechanism.
They have the flip down models now that you can bounce against a wall, and I don't even know how you would pull it, but I'm sure there's a way to pull it down and activate it that way, so it kind of removes that grasping.
So it's tight grasping, so just.
If you
Just hold it loose.
talk to accessibility, yes, that would be a good question for them. You know, the quarter that you put in the payphone requires pinching, so, you know, where do you draw that, that line?
Adjustable shower head and an accessible showers. How do you?
Well, you don't use one of these now.
But
Like
they
what I
do
had
have
with
the
the shower.
products where they make it accessible. The accessible ones, you can find them online.
If you can get your facility to put in too, that's great. It serves even more, potentially serves more people.
I see the problem with an adjustable one is you need that immediately. You don't have time to have somebody play with the thing, so it's gotta be right there. So I'm putting them in chemistry labs in the universities, where we're using them, and, you never know what's gonna go in there.
But if your hands are messed up with something and you cannot deal with it, or you have problems with arthritis,
I like that, and I'm
it
sure.
should be immediate access. You go there and just,
Great.
it serves everything. Okay.
So, any other big, sink questions before we move on? We survived sinks! So something else that's come about since I started doing this job is the use of hand, yes.
I do have a question, and this is always large, I'm not quite sure what it is. What is the thinking behind the 19-inch maximum underneath the back airflow space? What's?
I have an answer, but, okay, so what I've heard, one of the, it's kind of cool, since we've got like 15 to 20 CASPs working for us, and then we have these conference calls and everybody, you know, debates a given topic. One of the guys, Eric McSwain, very good, and he challenges the status quo all the time, and this is one of those areas where I had never considered this, and he pointed out, okay, if you put this code section together with that one, here's where it takes you. So when you've got a 19-inch maximum depth at a lavatory, and that says elsewhere in the code, you have to have, for the reach range over an object, you have to have equal clear floor space underneath it. So you go 19 under, 19 above, so you can't require people to be reaching more than 19 inches. And that was a whole nother dimension to, for me, I hadn't put the 2 and 2 things together in my mind. So now we've got a maximum reach range of 19 inches at a lavatory, and when you've got the 24-inch counter, that's a problem. So that's almost lost it there. That's my understanding of the why. I don't know if that's actually why DSA did it.
The 29 inches.
So it's really controlling the reach range.
Yeah.
Now, does anybody else have a different
You can
take?
have the reach, but you didn't meet the reach range with the 24-inch depth.
Right, but the depth requirement for the reach range can go up to 25,
25 miles.
where the depth, knee clearance depth is 19 for that.
Yes, but that's limited for laboratories.
Right.
And that's why you cannot have a soap dispenser farther back, one of those flat kind. It has to project at least
Right.
to the point where you can reach it, and your reach range
Within
doesn't
that.
extend more than 19 inches at a laboratory.
So other explanations for why it says 19?
Yeah, I thought it was, so if you had 30 by 48 required space in front, at the laboratory, that space could go under the sink.
That's your
Right.
usable space.
Yeah, so in other words, you could go up to 19 inches. But that's as far as you could use that 30 by 48, could go in there.
Yes, I think
Consider
that's.
So,
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's the most that you can account for your clear floor.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the feedback further, but you can only account for 9
Exactly.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
how I
totally
always-
clear.
Yeah, that's right.
And that extra space would have to be at the 27 inches for the knee clearance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing about that 27, kind of thinking along those same lines, if you're using, the dip of the overflow, you wouldn't count that when you're looking at a lab, that 29 inches at the front of the lab. But if you're wanting to use, for the turning space to swing under your lab, you need to make sure that the dip of the overflow clears that 27. Otherwise, you won't be able to use that space as part of your turning space.
The overflow is the 27-inch dimension, not the
Mhm. Right, but when you're doing knee clearance, you can ignore that little portion.
What I've heard from people with disabilities that have those motorized wheelchairs or the arms, is that to allow the 29, to allow the arm to be a little bit more, sometimes it will fit under, a better approach without having to turn it sideways.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it depends on the mobility device that you have. Some of them may not be as good and as flexible as the more expensive ones, and they're stuck with getting there and the arm doesn't move if it's fixed. So then it allows you a little bit to go in a little bit further.
Okay. Great questions. So sanitizers, they're getting used more and more lately. There are a lot to consider with sanitizers. That you've got the two-hand operation, the pump controls. Seems like more and more places are getting away from those. At least healthcare places are getting away from those, and they're using these. Does that have a special name?
Sensor?
Sensor.
Paddle. Thank you. Where it's just a push like a soap dispenser. The other thing to think about with these is the placement below signage. You see it a lot in hospitals where they'll place it, right where the caregiver's going to use it. They want to be able to use it quick as they run in or out of the room. And well, in this case, running into the room. But, you place it right below that braille signage, 3-letter braille signage, and it affects the usability of that sign. We recommend at least 12 inches clear below that sign. If you're going to make it completely usable. The other thing to think about that's similar to this is chart racks. They're quite often placed below a raised letter or braille sign, and you see a lot of that in clinics. They're getting away from charts more and more these days, going towards EMR, but we still see those chart racks just put right below those signs, and it affects it in the same way.
I thought that there can be nothing.
Nothing there.
Clear
18 by
space
18.
below the sign. And it can't be there at all. 12 inches is actually not compliant.
It has to
It
be
has to be completely outside of the legal of that.
18 by
18
18.
inch
Right,
space.
right.
So that's not a 4-inch obstruction.
No, doors actually are not. Doors, there's the,
16.
There is
8 inches.
a lot of thinking
But
that
that's
that
enough.
floor space has to be completely clear all the way up to the ceiling.
Yes.
Adrian too, so the access board about that, and he's kind kind of says that it's allowable to the 4 inches only because you can reach over it to still read it. And the clear space is beyond the 4 inch.
Yeah, it is a judgment call, because it's not just this reading of the sign, it's this reading of the sign as well.
Whether I was going to Sharon Togen's seminars, and she wrote the signage code, and she says clear is clear, 18-inch, nothing there.
All the way up.
So that's what I teach in my seminars, nothing there.
I think the sign,
Good.
clear space, if I remember right, it specifically says allows an approach within 3 inches of the sign.
The 91 standards said that.
I think that's still.
No, we just wrote it, it's not in the. Did they say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, they say clear.
Yeah, 2016 is 8.
You know, if I could chip in on that one, I don't have, we don't have a slide for this. I'll have to look up the language, because my recollection was the language for the 18-inch box has language that says something effect of to not be in the swing of a door.
Yeah, yeah, so, yeah.
And so,
So it's a full size.
right, so that raises a question. If it's all about not being hit by a door, then I wouldn't interpret it as being the sacred space. You know, Sharon Toji interpretation is it is absolutely free of anything.
It says it's a clear floor space of 18 inches minimum by center of the tactile characters beyond the arc swing of the door.
So if I don't have a arc, if you don't have a door there, I would argue, do I have to have an 18-inch by 18-inch box at all?
I think
No, it's where it's provided at a door, not at a doorway or.
where the doors are pushed.
But you still have to have that space,
My
so somebody
understanding
can
is-
stand to read the
That's,
sign.
I'm understanding that the point is that when somebody's there reading the Braille, you don't want a door to hit them. So there's this area they can stand in that's safe from being hit by a door.
Yeah.
If they're not gonna be hit by a door, they're okay. So then I separate in my mind okay, if I've got something like that below the sign, is that an issue?
And Sharon's told you.
I'm
is
saying
that-
it's not, but Sharon Toji
Sharon's
says yes.
explanation is that basically if you get close to the sign and you wanna read it, the people with low vision, not
Right,
the
right.
tactile readers, people with low vision, they really go like that. Because they need that closeness as opposed to the tactile reader can be a little bit further, you know?
I know, and then I've
So
my response
that,
is if there's something sitting here, I can still bend over it.
Yeah,
I
so
can
what-
bend over something that sticks out like
That's
that.
a good
So
court case.
is,
In other words, you have
what?
to see it.
Question for Mr.
So he said that's a good court case.
That's open to interpretation.
All right.
Let's roll.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. We have seen hand sanitizers called out in DOJ settlement agreements as protruding objects if they're 5 or 6 inches of projection. And they're,
So on, if you just show that, so on that one to the right there, you can see where it has the handrails in the hospital setting. I'm just being picky here, but yes, you normally would measure it from the wall, but since someone can't even walk that close to the wall, could you measure it from the handrail in that situation, since you have a lower and an upper rail there? So it's almost like a, where you build the wall, that's.
Where you go with the team.
Yeah.
measuring the sanitizer or the sign?
The
The
sanitizer.
protruding object.
Because that looks like it's more than 4 inches.
That's showing the sign, that's not showing the
Yeah,
projection.
yeah. I would just because it has a high
Yeah,
and low rail along there.
for the projection, since there's that low rail, yeah, I would measure it from the rail, not from the wall for the projection. So trash cans, just like everything else I've talked about for the last half hour, who uses it, where is it located? I would be hesitant at all to call that out if it was in a conference room, waiting room. Thank you very much. Window blinds and shades also depends on where they're located in conference rooms, waiting rooms, patient rooms. For a while, we kind of toyed with just leaving alone in waiting rooms, especially if it was a waiting room where there was a receptionist stationed all the time and staff was passing through. But then we encountered these beautiful waiting rooms at the end of, well, on each unit, each floor of this hospital tower. And it wasn't manned in any way. Housekeeping would come by once or twice a day, change out the trash, and that was really all that it was staffed. So you had these beautiful waiting rooms, floor to ceiling glass windows, and that afternoon sun would come in and it would just bake you up. So that was when I kind of decided, yeah, there are going to be some times when something like a waiting room, when the public's going to need to be able to operate those. Now, how that's handled in barrier removal and new construction could be different. You know, new construction, they absolutely have the opportunity to install something that's compliant from the get-go. We've seen some facilities put in automatic ones. But then we've had existing hospital facilities where they've decided they've tried to figure out what to do in existing patient rooms, and kids end up playing with them or breaking them, or you name it. It's happened in those patient rooms. And so they finally settled with the plaintiffs and decided to put up a sign that says, you know, blinds are intended to be operated by staff only. If you want them adjusted, just ring your nurse call button. And the plaintiffs were fine with that. So that could fly in a barrier removal situation. In Sharps boxes, Bill kind of touched on Sharps boxes earlier. 5 or 6 inches off the wall, there are going to be times when those are protruding objects. It's definitely a reach range issue for an employee that might need a reasonable accommodation. I'm sure y'all have seen them located in airport toilet rooms, or where did I see one? The baseball stadium in Birmingham not too long ago. Pretty new facility, and they have sharp boxes in those restrooms. So, you know, if it's located in a public place and it's by a diabetes clinic in a medical office building, and they might have those in the public toilet rooms, or at least patient toilet rooms to use. So, just important to consider reach range, clear floor space, typical things. So, cold buttons at water closets. Okay. Here we go again. Who's using it and why? And really, in this situation, where are they going to use it? Are they expected to use it from the toilet, or from the floor, or from either location? Does it have a pull cord? Marcia Maz of the Access Board has talked about this a good bit, and I believe, I need to look that up for next week. I believe that she settled on that the unit itself could be up higher if there was a pull string that went down low to put that in reach range.
The string's not possible.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
maybe, you know, that kind of goes back to the quarter coffee cup. Yeah, I see your argument on that.
There was something about Ashburn perhaps requiring that to be low enough, like 10 inches
could
from
be,
the
I'm
floor
not-
or so. So if people already are down in the floor, they can reach.
Yeah, I think you've got it, that
Yes.
it's required by code to have a nurse call with a string that's within 12 inches of the floor, so that somebody
Yes.
that falls on the floor can grab that string and call the nurse.
And the other thing we see with these quite often is that they're mounted, they're not flush mounted. Some can get up to 3/4 or 7/8 of an inch deep, and they're mounted really close to the grab bar in a location where somebody is really gonna, this one's pretty far back. That wouldn't be as serious of an issue to me if it were up here.
Doesn't it have to be on an accessible route?
Well, that goes back to the question
Usage.
of usage. And is it expected to be used from the toilet or the floor? Is it in a nursing situation where a person does their business and they call the nurse so that they can let the nurse know they're finished and they need assistance? Or is it to be used in an emergency situation?
Well, it could be all those.
It could be all those.
So that's why I think this location is not very good because if somebody's in the floor already couldn't reach it way in the back, so it has to be in front of the water closet.
But and that's gonna go back to the design of it. And when you're standing there looking at it in the field, you just have to ask yourself, and the nurses around or the staff that's around, how does this button get used?
You get enough,
Like it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
you get enough that toilet paper roll?
I really wanted to include one that was a
But not too far, so you can still grab it.
Since this gentleman brought up, toilet paper dispenser, so what about the protrusion of the toilet paper dispenser into the, now I recognize that it can be there by code, it's permitted to encroach into the clear space at the water closet, but, as is the grab bars, but, I mean, there's a point at which these jumbo rolls seem to me to be actually a barrier.
Yeah,
And
I
there's
don't,
no, I don't see anywhere where it's really addressed.
it's not, and it is a judgment call. You know, something like this one, especially with it being below the grab bar, is not a big issue. The Atlanta airport has dispensers that are at least 6 or 8 inches deep. And they're huge, and they're all located above the grab bar. So if you're trying to stand there and use the wall and the grab bar to balance, or, you know, fill in the blank for whatever needs to happen there, that can't happen because you're not over that many inches. So that's a whole other discussion, right, with dispensers and.
No, I mean, I probably just like all of you, it's a judgment call. There's a point in my mind where they are so big, I would call it a barrier.
And is the jumbo roll measured, it's a dual jumbo roll, it's a center line,
We can roll on, because this is a question next week on Ask the Cats.
Roll on. Roll on.
So, in rehab facilities, you have kitchen and shower and training rooms where the intent is to bring you in if you're a patient, teach you how to use that kitchen, bathroom, shower, tub. The therapist side of me says that really needs to not be a perfect situation, so I can teach somebody kind of how the real world operates. However, Chapter 12 has some specific requirements for these, so my line of thinking does apply in California. So this is just a heads up that there are some requirements in Chapter 12 for those. We'll agree to disagree.
Oh, that's hold on. Wow. So I'm going to do a quick case study here. I won't spend too much time on it. So this is an example of a barrier removal project. So the small world that it is, Kaylin's group did the survey to define barriers in all of our facilities, including this one. We gave that document over to our architect, who then developed a set of drawings to remove barriers in this building. So I'm going to go through that. Go back to drawings. So the barrier removal in that building, of course, there's barriers in this room, this room, this room, this room, this room, on the first and second floor. So we're going to look at kind of department by department. This set of drawings, actually, it was by your office, who does fine work for us. I really like that they do this kind of color-coded drawing that shows there's a color coding for the circle, a color coding for the space required for the door, the 36-inch aisle required at the side of a piece of equipment, and so on. So very quickly you can run through and see that it has the required areas. Now what this drawing doesn't show is what the barriers were. So you have to take my word for it. There were barriers in this room. What we found we had to do then is, I'm going to take a step back on this whole thing. I'm going to back up on the drawing to put it in a little bit of perspective. There's a whole bunch of rooms, and there's barriers throughout. So through a fairly complicated arrangement, we're under lawsuit and consent decree. So it was agreed, we'll do this one, this one, this one, and that one, not all of them. So we're removing barriers in certain rooms that are agreed upon. So in that context, this particular room was one of those that we were removing barriers from. And effectively, we had to rework the whole room. Now, this is one that touches on a topic we went through earlier, that it's a room with a treadmill. So what's the appropriate way to do that? By the book, going back to our earlier discussions, it's not a general exam room, but we're reluctant to say you have to have an aisle on both sides of the treadmill. And in this case, we're going to say the treadmill, it's not an exam table, it's not a bed, it's not a lounge chair or a gurney, so we're not going to apply it to the treadmill. And then this is the exam table, and we're flat out saying with these two things in one room, we're going to pitch the argument that you only need it on one side, and we'll see if we get any traction with that. Just the general design of the room. I don't know if this reads for you. This is the computer station, which is essentially in every one of our rooms now. So the docs, as you've probably all gone to your doctor, they all keep records on the computer now. So this is where that occurs. We're putting them as far from the door as possible so that you've got a path that you can get to the chair, you can come in and go to the sink or the computer. You've got a path and it reads and it functions pretty well.
You didn't require the 36-inch clear space next to the treadmill under 1004, or because it's not a recreational facility, it wouldn't apply in this instance?
Well, I think this is something that has to go. This was an earlier generation of the drawing. That has to go so that you can get
So at least one side you have the transfer situation.
You could make the argument that this is exercise equipment, it's diagnostic equipment.
Yeah, I mean, this is off the books.
Thinking,
right? Yeah. So that was one room type. We got gerontology. I'm not even sure what urodynamics is. So we've got a procedure table, aisle on both sides. You come in, our computer station is kind of out of the way here. The guest chair is here. Again, what we had to do is rework, and I want to kind of fill you in with what we're grappling with as a company dealing with these requirements. The building is already there. The building was surveyed 3 or 4 years ago, before the 2013 building code existed and before the 2010 ADA existed. So it was surveyed 3 or 4 years ago to a different set of standards.
4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So now we fast forward to the present day and we're actually getting to work removing the barriers. There's new standards in place. There's a legitimate question as to what extent, as we talked earlier about remodeling a room, if we remodel this thing here, does it trigger the whole room? If we remodel this thing and this thing and this thing, does it trigger the whole room? We determined we were doing enough work in the room that the whole room essentially constitutes a construction project, which then requires 2013 building code compliance. But in some of our other rooms, we might say, well, those walls are where they are. We're not building anything. We're just moving the furniture around within the room. We'd argue the 2013 building code and these clearances don't apply.
Was this a settlement though?
Yes, it was.
So you didn't identify specific things in the settlement, or
Oh,
are you
no,
still
we got-
going through this?
We got pages and pages and pages and pages of files of agreements and specific things. So part of that is we have to do X number of exam rooms, X number of procedure rooms. Because all these things are so specialized right down to its urodynamics, it becomes a negotiation where, okay, what if we do one of them in this building?
So did Oshkosh or SA agree with, I mean,
Well, they're not part of the discussion.
but don't they have to plan check it?
Well, that's a different thing there, but yeah. So when the plan check it, we're remodeling this room for barrier removal.
So it's
It goes to the building department and they plan check this room. The other rooms, we're not doing work in, plan check. Does that make sense?
It's very early on.
So kind of, because I have a hospital that's, part of this was, it's very confusing, of course, until our attorney got a call. So the accessible parking was what I was involved with. And the settlement agreement was not to provide van accessible, but just to upgrade accessible. And every one of them, so none of van accessible were required as part of the settlement. And so, of course, wasn't agreeing with that, and I was told.
Yeah, and I, obviously we
So
get
I just
into.
wondered how, I guess, so at what point, or in your settlement agreement, just, does that take?
Well, they all look different. The settlement agreement is whatever it is, the attorneys,
But it may not, I get, so it doesn't necessarily mean what I'm looking at.
You may have some insight that I don't. Because I think to a large degree, the judges don't get involved in this. This is so involved, the judges said they're going to be the judge. They are Eventary Associates. They are appointed as the subject matter jurisdiction experts. When we have a question as to the extent, that goes to their office, literally. Then they render a decision, and that's what we are bound to do. If we want to push back, we'll negotiate or talk, and eventually, nonetheless, their word is pretty much final.
Yeah, and the plaintiffs usually know that it's not going to be fully compliant with building code or ADA or whatever code applies. A lot of plaintiffs will tend to settle on things that are not quite so important to them, like if they're a power chair user and they can handle a higher vertical transition of maybe half an inch or 3/4 of an inch instead of a 1/4 inch unbeveled. Well, they might negotiate that out and say, yeah, we'll accept this higher target for vertical transition.
So I have to accept that as a building official?
For that project. Now, as building official, that's.
Yeah, Gary wants to.
And I know you're going to keep going, you probably are getting this.
No, that's right. What's up, Gary?
I'm no attorney or nothing to provide legal advice, but very familiar with the litigation process. That just because you have a settlement agreement with one law firm or attorney firm does not mean that that's all you have to fix and fix it the way that they indicate, because it still leaves you as an open duct to someone else in litigation that they won't agree with. If something's going to be altered or repaired, it needs to comply with the applicable code at the time of construction, which if they're going to alter the accessible parking at that time, then the proper van accessible parking would be required. That's my interpretation. In my case, it was the signature of the judge, and I did go to our city attorney and let them know that I was less than reasonable. Well, that's the whole thing. That was, well,
So you're in.
I've been put in the same situation as a building official, and the city attorney, and with construction tolerance. And, this was, these Dollar Generals. Dollar Generals have these counters that are constructed, they're 34.25 inches high above the floor. That's not compliant. So say there's construction tolerance within it. I still recommended that they put, even though the city attorney got involved in everything else, I still made them put a throw carpet down that would bring it that 4 inches. So when I went out and final that building, I did take a picture of it, that it was a 34 inch. So we still have our requirements that we have to follow. Despite what they wanted.
Isn't there something in the code in the area of the alterations that allows you to be very removal specific, so you limit yourself to the scope of work, and it seems here that the judge or you guys are defining a barrier removal project, so it gets you out of the whole path of travel and everything else. So typically would go as a normal alteration project, right? Like
in my case, it was 12 stalls, 12 spaces, and none had been accessible.
Well,
So that was
that's an element by element, so it's not taking into account the rest of the count in the lot. It's looking at just that one stall and fixing that one stall. There may be a number of them, but you're not looking at it as a whole like you normally do.
Yeah, that's something that I'm glad you brought up. So on this project, we're fixing maybe 10 rooms in this building. We are not doing any path of travel work.
Right.
Because we're doing barrier removal work, and the code gives us an exception for doing barrier removal work. It doesn't trigger path of travel. This question?
I was just gonna say, the code also says whenever you do any construction, you have to comply with the current code, so I would be inclined to agree with him that you should include the inaccessible if you were to.
Yeah, I can't speak for
I
that.
don't allow for you to not so. Yeah.
Well, let me go, I've got one last thing here on this example, and then we'll turn it back over to Kaylin to finish us up on medical equipment. This is an audiology room, and we are having real issues with audiology. We've got all of these hospitals and medical facilities, and this is one continuing thing that keeps coming up because audiology booths prior to current times have been something that you buy and they set it up, they lean the four walls up and they build this booth in the side of your building, and they're about the size of a phone booth.
And aren't they usually raised so that they're?
And they're raised, so not to blame you guys, but then Evan Terry's office comes in and says, oh, this audiology booth is nowhere near compliant. And our folks are going, okay, and then this example isn't so bad, but we've got several of them where you've got booth, 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 booth. And yeah, you have to ramp up into them because they're made soundproof, including the floor. Some of these are made so that the one wall is basically a large hinged door. The door is only 6'2" or something crazy, completely inaccessible. And so we've been kind of tugging back and forth saying, well, can we call it a piece of equipment and say it doesn't have to comply with the building code requirements because it's a piece of equipment. And, you know, we're not getting much traction on that. That really, we need to refer to it as a building. Clearly, when you build one new, you can do it right. It's easy enough to have an audiology booth that's big enough with a door that's compliant, so on and so forth. But boy, the old existing ones are just causing enormous problems. Very difficult and expensive. To fix one of these is like an $80,000 thing. So,
how high are they up?
well, they're, I don't know, 2 to 3 inches, but it's enough that the
Or up to
slope.
6, you've seen them
Oh,
up
have
to
you seen it?
6.
6? Wow. So it gets to be a fairly significant little run up into it. So that's one of the kind of things, this is not in a hospital, this is in a medical office building. So you guys may run into these.
Sounds like it's a historic booth.
So I'm gonna call it that, and turn it back over to Kaylin.
Can I ask you just to clarify one thing you said?
Yeah.
You mentioned that, and I think this was part of the litigation, consent decree, that you chose to analyze one room, let's say, using a former code and bringing it to compliance based on a former code, and then one where there was more work going on.
Oh, okay.
So did this go through a building department or other jurisdiction?
Yeah, let me explain that that's not, if that's what I said, I didn't intend to.
That's what I heard.
It
I don't
was
know what you
surveyed
said.
to the current code. That just happened 4 or 5 years ago. Is that what he said?
But the implementation.
Well, it was surveyed to previous versions of the code.
But the implementation of, I thought you said you chose to implement the prior version in one room.
If that's what it sounded like, I apologize.
That's what I heard.
We had no choice but to do it. If we're doing it in 2014, we have to do it to the standards that apply today, even though it was surveyed earlier.
Okay.
So that's what's caused a lot of fits because these new requirements kicked in, and we've had to be very heads up that the survey says this, but wait a minute, we also have to add on to it 15 more things because current code dictates that. So I don't want to take any more time on this when we get back to the medical.
Gary, where do we sit time-wise? Because I can make this last section fast.
We have, well, 3 o'clock is the ending time, so
Okay.
we would still like to get them out.
Let me just talk briefly about equipment then. There's the DOJ guidance document, which is technical assistance document. put out by the Department of Justice in July 2010. And it has I won't walk you through all of the stuff in this document. If you haven't seen it before, it's worth a good thorough read if you have some medical healthcare clients or projects that you're working on. But I will jump forward to diagnostic medical equipment because I think this is going to be a hot button in the future. There aren't any technical requirements for the equipment itself right now. Part of the Affordable Care Act tasked the Access Board along with FDA to write some technical requirements. And so the Access Board put those proposed standards out a few years ago. Then they put this advisory committee together, and the advisory committee commented or discussed those comments and made some recommendations based on those public comments. So now it's back in the Access Board's lap to make changes to those proposed standards and hopefully someday publish some standards for diagnostic medical equipment. Then it'll be up to DOJ and whatever other enforcing authority there is to develop scoping requirements and think about the bigger picture as far as the spaces where this equipment's used, the clearance issues, all of those things that we couldn't think about with the equipment itself, because the Access Board standards really is just for that piece of equipment itself. Really the closest they get to clearances on this equipment is for mammography machines and space the patient needs to be able to use that equipment. And what was the other one? Mammography and weight scales. So that committee's report is out on the Access Board's website now, and we're just in a holding pattern right now, waiting for the Access Board and for Department of Justice to do their piece.
So you're on the committee for that?
The committee's finished. Our work finished a little over a year ago.
And do you know how this will apply to existing facilities versus new construction?
Yep.
What the scoping will be for that?
No, that's all up to the Department of Justice, and they've given us no kind of timeline or hints about what they're thinking. They were always, there was always one Department of Justice person at the table as part of the discussion, and then there were always at least 2 or 3 or 4 other Department of Justice people in the audience. So to me, that signaled that that's a very important topic for them. Who knows what's going to happen with it.
It's critical to the usability of certain diagnosis for people with disabilities.
So the standards, they don't really talk about specific equipment other than mammography. Well, they don't talk about, let me skip to the next slide, this will make more sense. Instead of talking about this kind of table has to have this height and width requirement, they broke it down into the positions that the equipment's used. So for supine, prone, face down, and sideline position, exam tables, gurneys, and stretchers would fall into that category. For equipment where the patient uses it in a seated position, exam chairs like you see in podiatry or dental offices would fall into that category. And you're probably seeing that some exam tables have the capability to be both a chair and a table, which is a really cool technology that's coming up. Others in the seated position are mammography and weight scales. Then in a standing position would be mammography as well and weight scales. And then they did have a few requirements for controls and for operable parts and communication. Communication, thinking about something like a way to communicate it with the tech if you're in an MRI machine, and the tech has to have you hold your breath or stop squirming or things like that. There aren't very many requirements for operable parts and communication on the medical equipment. So the big hot button is the hot topic issue that we talked about more than anything else was the transfer surface at exam tables and chairs. And the transfer surface, I think about a transfer surface as kind of a temporary space. It's something that somebody uses when they're trying to get from their chair or their scooter onto the table or exam chair. So it's something they're using to pass from one spot to another. And we talked to no end about height, the height of the transfer surface, which is going to affect the height of the exam table or chair, the size of the transfer surface, and when we finally realized that the size of the transfer surface does not mean that that's the size of the table. So the width of the transfer surface, I don't even remember what we settled on for a recommendation now, but it caused so much discussion because people were thinking, well, if you have a 30-inch or a 28-inch wide transfer surface, that means the table has to be X number of inches wide. So if you keep that thought separate, that it doesn't mean that it's the same size as the table or the chair. That helps clear it up in my mind. And then the other thing with the transfer surface are the transfer size. Is there some kind of support? Not every table or chair is going to provide an armrest to use during a transfer, but if one's provided, we talked about requirements for that. And there are also some guidelines for lift compatibility, those floor lifts that, like what I was talking about before, the lift can get under the table or around the table. Then in a seated, for equipment used in a seated position, exam chairs have that same transfer surface, although I would anticipate the size of the transfer surface being a little bit different for an exam chair. And then supports and lift compatibility, same as the exam table. Or equipment used in a supine, prone, or sideline position. Also in a seated positions mammography, we talked a lot about mammogram machines and knee clearance, the breastplate height, the handholds, and how those affect the exam. We talked a good bit about the plate down here at the bottom that's going to affect toe clearance, which is going to affect the clear floor space and where a chair can get positioned at that mammogram machine. A mammogram machine in California is going to need more bracing than one in Central Florida because of your earthquakes that you keep talking about. And there's so much designed into that equipment as a whole, but that one little piece, some manufacturers use it for advertising, some use it as a reminder to the tech as a safety measure to set something or unlock something before they do what it is that they do. Some manufacturers felt they could eliminate it, some couldn't, and it just went round and round and round. But I think we ended up settling on something that can be useful for most wheelchair or scooter users, as far as getting somebody up to the machine as far as they need to go. Wheelchair scales, we talked about platform scales and how much ramping would be needed, how high we could go for that platform and keep it safe. We talked about edge protection and standing supports. For somebody that only gets weighed once a year, that's a big deal to even get to see one that has a ramp on it that's not one of those little platform things where you have to balance. Mammogram machines and weight scales also get used in a standing position, obviously. So we talked about standing supports and one side, both sides for weight scales. And I think that those requirements will depend on how the scales access. Is it straight up, full on, get weighed, back off? Is it full on, It way go straight off on the other side. Because for somebody in a chair, they don't need the standing supports, but somebody walking up or stepping up onto the scale, having something on both sides could be very beneficial. So we talked about where the ramped entry is and how many sides that would be on and how that would impact the standing supports.
Is that if the ramp is integral to the piece of equipment as opposed to site built? If
Yes.
site built, then it needs to meet
We didn't talk about site built because we were limited to being able to talk about the equipment itself.
So if it's an integral part of the equipment.
Yeah.
Okay.
We did talk a little bit about possible, thinking outside the box and possible solutions, but not so much with platform scales. And lifts, we talked about lifts a little bit before. It's provides a lot of peace of mind for the patients, but even more importantly, it provides a safer environment for the patient and for the staff. I believe Cal OSHA has some requirements for patient safe handling that you guys have probably heard about. That's a pretty new requirement or thought in California. But there are things to think about with lifts, whether they're portable lifts or ceiling lifts. And if you have an opportunity or a client where you can talk to them about this and convince them to think about this big picture. It's not just providing the lift, it's providing training for everybody that's going to use it, making sure they have the slings so that you don't have the huge extra large ones for us itty bitty people. And where are they going to store that lift? We see them stashed in the hallways, in the corridors a good bit. And then there's scheduling issues that go along not just with a lift, but with any kind of piece of accessible equipment, because if they've only got accessible equipment in 1 or 2 rooms out of 10 or 15 rooms, they just need to have a procedure and a policy in place for how they're going to handle that. Is it flagged on the scheduling end, and the scheduling person pulls up the patient's records and it has a flag that says, hey, this person needs this accessible room. That's what I do with one of my doctors. They don't have a flag in their system, but I know every year or two when I go to see that doctor, I say, hey, I need the high-low, the table that goes high and low. We usually schedule me into the procedure room, and they say, no problem, because they do it with other patients, not just me. Ceiling lifts are pretty cool. We're seeing this more and more. There's a large hospital on the East Coast, and I don't know how many beds they have, but it's a very large facility. In every patient room, they have gone in as a retrofit and installed ceiling lifts, and their nurses are very happy. I would love to go back to them and say, okay, what are your injury numbers and how have they gone down since you put all these ceiling lifts in? But I don't have that information. The one in this picture is really, really cool because it's hard to see, but it's a ceiling lift that serves it's on a rehab unit, serves the bed, so nursing can come in, get the patient out of the bed, and take them into the toilet room, take them to the toilet, and then move them over to the shower, all through that ceiling lift, and so that reduces the risk of injury to everybody significantly. And that was a retrofit.
How much does one of those cost, do you know?
No idea. Do you know?
I don't know.
Less than a lawsuit.
Scratch value also is a consideration.
Yeah.
Well, you know, workers' comp, and all this stuff, if employees are taxed, we say,
Times 3.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
and plus the benefit of the comfort of the patient.
Yeah, that hospital on the East Coast has looked at it that way. And then they realized, once we came in and said, wow, this is really cool, they realized, oh, this is providing better access to everybody. It's not just helping the nurses.
Marketing.
Yeah, absolutely marketing.
Health insurance.
So the big picture, all the stuff that we've talked about today, plus staff training, staff training, staff training, staff training, staff training, Scheduling, coordination, you can have a beautiful, perfectly accessible piece of equipment, a high-low exam table, and stick it in an exam room that doesn't have door maneuvering clearance or any kind of clear floor space or turning space. Stick it down in a room where most of the staff doesn't even know it exists, they don't know how to operate it. Any kind of, it takes a lot for a piece of equipment and a room to be accessible. It's not just that equipment itself. And so it's that big picture, all of those things all put together to me that determines the accessibility of it. And then as you're talking to your clients, whether big or small doctor's offices, other things to think about are sign language interpreters. The Department of Justice and the U.S. attorneys are really big on this topic right now. So most of the settlement agreements that you see through DOJ and healthcare right now have to do with sign language interpreters.
Yeah, chip in on this. So I've talked a lot about today my world at Sutter. I'm Sutter's access specialist for building code or physical access compliance. I have a counterpart who's more along your lines, Carol Bradley, and is dealing with the whole other side of what we do at Sutter in the patient care side of it, procedures and policies. And then we have a third person who is dealing just with the medical equipment. So the lawsuit correspondingly has these three different components. It's the physical access, building code standards compliance, policies and procedures, and medical equipment. The lawsuit is laid out that way. The lawsuit on Kaiser similarly was laid out that way with these three separate components. So while we're doing all this building code compliance stuff, they're over there doing all these policies and procedures things, as well as separately acquiring equipment. So it's actually 3 times as big as what I presented.
So, you survived. Any questions?
All
It's a lot.
That was a good job. Now, just so you guys are familiar with, when is this going to come in place for you? Soon. Probably has some for some of you already. You have heard them indicate Kaiser Permanente, and they have had a lawsuit, and in that lawsuit, one of their agreements was all doctors' facilities and medical facilities that use their insurance company, the Kaiser insurance plan or any of that, has to become accessibility requirement. Okay, they have to meet the requirement and they have to get an accessible survey. This is going to trigger phone calls from doctor medical offices. One thing to keep in mind is what they showed here that we usually don't get involved with is program accessibility. Because with program accessibility, this is one of the things that was indicated that they're working towards is, okay, not every doctor's office has to have an accessible scale. Not every doctor's office or hospital has to have the accessible X-ray equipment. But there's got to be a location that every doctor can refer their patient to that has full accessibility for your X-ray equipment and for that. So that's going to be equivalent facilitation. Is they're going to say, well, we're going to send you over to this hospital to get your X-rays and your treatments and everything because they have accessibility. So these are things that we will want to look at as a CAS when we go out and look at these medical facilities if we're requested to go out and do a survey, is ask them what's your policy and procedure for sending disabled. Okay, so very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So to move forward, we're not going to go over our hardship form because we won't have time, but we'll go over others. I think most people are familiar with the hardship form. We can go over that. in the future. Anybody that's a building official and building inspector, if you are associated with CALBO, the CALBO Access Committee, Chris Hansen and myself are on that committee. We have put together a hardship form that's available to all CALBO members to download and use. And CASI is going to use the similar one because having CASI board members grouped with CALBO Access Committee, CALBO and CASI are coming together in unity on accessibility. So the purpose of this is to provide all forms, or to provide forms that are familiar to all of us. Okay, instead of having 40 different forms throughout the state, we're trying to get them all to one style of form. These are being made available via Word version, cheap, so very cost effective. CASI members will be able to download them for free off of our CASI website. They're Word versions, so you can modify them accordingly if you want to put your letterhead on it. If you're a jurisdiction, you want to put your letterhead on it, or you want to personalize it yourself. The same with these little tickler checklists and stuff. They're not saying that CASI approves these and has reviewed them and said, yes, this is set stone. No, it's a tool that we're kind of providing to you. Just like you can go buy a tape measure, how you read that tape measure is how you read it. Whether you use the tolerance of a tape measure, how many are familiar with the tolerance of a tape measure? Okay, well there is a tolerance for a tape. How many use it? I don't know. You know, it's a 16th of an inch because it pulls out and pushes in.
16th of an inch per, what, 15 feet or something?
Yeah, something like that. So, you know, it's about how you use the tool, and the tool is just there for you to use it as whatever. It's not CASI approved. The other thing in our strategic planning meeting is, as you, most CASI members, if you look at your emails, you probably see an email blast come out earlier this week, I believe on Monday, that was advertising a book of Janice Kent's and a training on some scoping of myself.
Never got that.
Okay. There's a number of people that never got that email. A lot of people have complained about not seeing email.
They're really blacklisted.
Yeah, that happens, especially if you write along with me, right? So, but the thing is what this is it's a strategic planning meeting. We're trying to provide things that are beneficial to the CASI members, things that you can use. And one thing is twice a month, there's going to be an email blast going out to all the members. If you want to advertise something in this email blast, then you just get it in a week in advance to David or to Cassie, and it will be in this email blast. This is not saying that if there's a training of myself or of Gilda or of Chris or anybody that does trainings that Cassie supports and authorizes this training. It's just saying this is a CASI member that's letting everybody know that this service is there. The same with contractors. If you do construction and you want to advertise that, hey, I do ADA construction in this area, and you want to throw an advertisement blurb out, you can use it and it will go out. You just got to get it there a week in advance. If you're an architect and you want to get it out that, hey, I do architectural designs on accessibility in your location and area, because some of us that are CAS, I no longer do surveys, but some people do surveys still that would like to know if there's architects in their area. This gives you the ability to reach out to other CASI members. So this is what it's about. I know we have some that are specialize in signage. You know, Chris Cisneros, right? He's Sharon Toji's son, expert in signage. How many of us are experts in signage? I ain't raising mine, right? So with this being said, if they want to advertise so we know where to go, there we go. If you're looking for help, need some help, assistance, even if it's for 1 week because you got a large project, or if it's for a month, or if it's permanent, it gives you the opportunity to get it in an email blast out. And of course, it will go on the other page as well of the website. But it gives that opportunity for an email blast as well as for us as members to be able to review if we're looking for any of this. And it gives us the ability, it's kind of like a newspaper, you know, your want ads, you know, and so it will be experts and professionals in our field. That's one thing that we have done to gear up. Other things is we're going to provide more, like I said, the tickler checklist. We're going to put together a checklist that you can use, not necessarily a checklist, but a format of things that you can use and be able to go off of. And no, they're not saying that these are bulletproof because you are the operator of the list. But it's something that we're providing availability to. With that, we have other members that would like to speak. Michelle, I would like for her to bring up about the outreach and the website.
Well, you guys turned off the projector. Were we gonna show them the website?
We can show them the website, sure.
Yeah. Well, while he's pulling the website up, I'm gonna reiterate again that CASI is gonna be sending out an email to you probably on Monday. We are gonna be looking for content for our website. So everybody in this room is already considered an expert.